So I'm going to change it up a little bit. I only have one slide of any value, although you'll tell me if it has any value at all. I'm just going to have a chat to you. A bit of a truth bomb. Okay? Most large companies are completely crap at innovation. Okay? Now, I've lived my professional life at the intersection of both entrepreneurship and large corporates. So as Fred said, I've started over 10 different companies. Some were great, some weren't. And I also founded McKinsey and Company's digital data and agile practice, where when I was lead partner there, I got to advise really large incumbents. And having lived at this intersection, I find it fascinating to look at the best practice innovation that we've been hearing about today and reconcile that with just how few organizations actually manage to deliver anywhere close to that best practice. Which leads me to my real interest and passion. So I think a lot of us are getting it wrong. Many of us, Vibrance included, spend a lot of time trying to shape systems and processes to create environments that are more conducive to innovation. We work on important enablers such as funding mechanisms, resourcing and talent processes, risk and governance, all in an attempt to free up innovation. But I'm increasingly convinced that we're only focused on half the picture. There are deeper, more fundamental impediments to innovation that often get ignored because they're harder to access. And I believe that these impediments are more intrinsic to how we perceive ourselves and where we derive our all-important sense of self-worth. And I've tried to capture these impediments in the form of 5 personal realizations. But before we jump in, I have a quick discussion exercise. You can see slides, no worth, right? Just pretty pictures. A quick discussion exercise. And I want you to go back in time to February 2020, just when we were all hearing about the pandemic. And imagine that you are the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, and with your magic crystal ball, you could find out the answer to just one question. Okay? Now remember, we're at the start of the pandemic when there were so many unknowns. Okay? What question would you ask that crystal ball? Okay? So what I'd like you to do now, I'm going to give you literally 60 seconds to do this on your table. Just call out a question you might ask your crystal ball. Don't overthink it. I'm going to go really fast. 60 seconds starts now. Okay, you all shouted out your question? Okay, let me ask you, I'm going to stop you there. If you didn't get a chance, it's not the end of the world. Let me ask one other question. Did any table have a situation where everyone had exactly the same question? Can you raise your hands if that was the case? Okay, I want you to hold that thought. And let me now introduce the 5 realizations. So when it comes to innovation, personal realization number 1, you don't know the question. Number 2, you're not smart enough to know the answer, even if you did know the question. Number 3, the only way to win is to lose repeatedly, and your ego won't like losing. So number 4, you and your egos are the problem. And number 5, your job is to stop you and your senior colleagues from being the problem. Now, unfortunately, embracing some of these realizations won't really get you anywhere. I'm afraid to say they're a bit of a package deal. A failure to embrace one of these most likely means a failure to innovate. And they build on each other. You can't sort of skip to realization 4 or 5 without first having embraced realizations 1, 2, and 3. So let's start with realization number 1. You don't know the question. Now, some of you may remember the introduction of home label groceries into our supermarkets back in the 80s. And the big grocery chains wanted to understand what consumers were looking for when it came to home label groceries, so they ran some focus groups, and they received a very consistent perspective. But consumers were looking for value for money. So they designed these tins and jars of food with stark white labels and black writing on it. Okay, and when they tested these product labels with customers, the feedback was resounding. They represented price-driven value. The problem was that these products just weren't selling. So eventually, ethnographers started to follow around the supermarket the few customers who were buying these products and even went back into their homes. And they noticed something unusual. When these customers were unpacking the groceries, these tins, they were putting them at the back of their pantry, hidden behind other products. And this happened regularly enough that the researchers started to wonder why. So they asked. And it turns out that the motivator was one of shame and guilt. These customers often couldn't afford to buy the pricey brands, and so while these products screamed value for money, they also reminded the buyers that they weren't able to nourish their family with the good stuff. Hence why they hid those products at the back of their pantry. They didn't want to be reminded every single day that they were not looking after their families in the way that they would like to. So customers were saying one thing, and yet, they were saying we want value for money, and yet their actions were driven by a motivator that perhaps they themselves were not even aware they had. Shame. Okay? Once this was understood, home label groceries shifted to shiny packaging that was almost indistinguishable from the pricey stuff, and sales shot through the roof. So when it comes to innovation and breaking new ground through innovation, we rarely, if ever, know what the right question is. What do you want from home labels certainly wasn't it. So the real work was not finding an answer, but working out what question we should be asking in the first place. And that is not a brainstorming exercise. Finding the right question is born out of observation. Now, earlier today, Josie spoke about the Cynefin framework that distinguishes between complicated and complex. So innovation is a complex problem where we're sailing into new waters. You can't simply find the answer to the most pressing question. The work is in finding what question to ask in the first place. Just like in our COVID table exercise, the question isn't always obvious, nor is it unanimous. People have different perspectives. But this is a big challenge for innovation because most of our problem-solving methodologies in the workplace start with the problem being defined. Now, when I was at McKinsey, we had something called the 7 steps to bulletproof problem solving. And step 1 is all about the problem statement that gets you aligned around what are you solving for. In other words, what is the question? You spend the first hour agreeing this. You spend the rest of day 1 doing what's called your issue tree and your work plan. And then if you have 3 months for the project, you spend the next 11 weeks and 4 days finding the answer. You define the question in an hour, and then the rest of the time, by the way, that defining the question, that's called divergent thinking, and you spend the rest of the project around convergent thinking, which is trying to find the solution. So when I introduced human-centered design back into McKinsey, in McKinsey Australia, there was no surprise that all my designers got absolutely slammed by the McKinsey partners in their semi-annual reviews for not being able to find an answer to converge to an answer. My designers wanted to spend not just 1 hour, but more like 10 weeks out of 12 looking for what the right question was. So when it comes to innovation, you, me, your bosses, the CFO, the innovation gurus around the room, God forbid the board, simply don't know what the right questions are. So why do we have steercos where wise heads get to ask us questions? Why do we have investment approval committees which ask questions before freeing up funds for innovation initiatives? One of my clients had 149 out of 150 innovation initiatives approved because the investment approval committee asked 2 questions. The first one was, will this meet our required hurdle rate? And the second one was, have you identified the resources needed to drive this forward? Well, every initiative that went to the IAC had an Excel model that magically met the hurdle rate, right? Based on a whole bunch of bullshit assumptions that no one could really challenge, such as market uptake. Okay? Moreover, just because the resources had been identified didn't mean that they were available to work on that project. When I looked at the 149 initiatives, they actually had resources in total to work on 5. But what we ended up getting was a merry-go-round of project starts and nothing actually getting delivered. All because senior people in the IAC, which included the CFO, thought they knew the right questions. So the first personal realization for innovation is that you don't know the right question. Searching for the right question is part of what makes innovation successful. So let's look at personal realization number 2. So going back to the Cynefin framework, the majority of us have grown up in the world of complicated. It's how we've been trained. All the way from our schooling, we've been taught to ask questions and then find answers. And we were judged on the quality of our answers, which in turn puts a premium on knowledge and expertise. And we'll dive into the Cynefin framework, the complicated complex, and what that means in practice a little more in my workshop tomorrow. But in the world of complicated, you put enough bright folks in front of a whiteboard and they'll solve the problem, okay, based on intellects and smarts and expertise. Knowledge in this case is power. Knowledge is the ticket to play. Yet the big assumption here is that even when we have the right question, that our brains have the capacity to find the answer. Well, for most complicated problems, that in fact is true. So take, for example, a Ferrari. A Ferrari is a complicated problem. We can break a Ferrari into 1,000 little pieces, and if you have someone with the right expertise, they can put it back together again, a bit like Humpty Dumpty. But how should we solve global warming? How would we minimize deaths from COVID back in 2020? These are not complicated problems, they're complex ones. They involve networks and ecosystems, secondary and tertiary impacts, a bit like Olga discussed in her talk about design systems thinking. And they all interact with each other in ways that we can't foresee. No one was able to model out COVID and the impacts in society. If minimizing deaths was the right question to be asking, then that would need to be considered in light of the reduced number of deaths from flu, from the impacts of domestic violence, mental health challenges, economic distress. And this is simply too hard to model. We can't create an Excel where we put some numbers in for months 1, 2, and 3 based on growth rates and assumptions, just drag ourselves out to the right. And yet large corporates expect to see exactly this when judging innovation, such as when asked to show me the anticipated ROI based on projected cash flows. So innovation is not complicated, it's complex. And therefore relying on expert knowledge to find the answer just simply doesn't work. The only way to do so is via emergent problem solving, probe, get some feedback, work out the answers through trial and error. But this runs fundamentally contrary to the pursuit of an answer that most senior executives are looking for before they release funds or put some resources behind innovation. So questions like, what is the anticipated payback period? What reasonable amount of market share can you capture? What are the likely revenue streams? How will you defend your IP? How will competitors respond? They all seem like really reasonable questions. Yet what they do is they force us to treat a complex problem as if it were complicated. We falsely believe that these ideas are discernible, and before you know it, the emperor's not wearing any clothes. Now, that's not to say that innovation should be a fact-free zone with no data. On the contrary, it should be data-rich. But it requires a realization that you won't be able to find the answers via intellect. The only way to do so is ask questions. Observe the answers, which is data, refine your questions, and observe again. And doing this creates lots of decisionable data, but it's premised on the realization that sitting at our desks or standing at the whiteboard, none of us are smart enough to know the answer in advance, which is pretty hard to accept when our entire lives we have been judged on our ability to find answers. So let's go to realization number 3. Now, everyone in this room understands the power of iteration, or I hope so. However, what does iteration do to our egos? That's a question that most people don't think about. So I can recall a conversation I had with the CEO and the CMO of a big global bank. And we were talking about the power of experimentation when it comes to digital marketing, so iteration in digital marketing. And the CFO puffed out his chest and claimed that he had built a culture of test and learn experiments within his function. So I asked him what their success rate was, and he claimed very proudly that it was just under 80%. And that told me everything I needed to know. Most experiments fail, as you've heard today. This needs to be our ingoing expectation. And I told the CMO and the CEO that they should be looking to reverse that outcome. I would have been happier if only 20% would have been succeeding, because that would have told me that they were sufficiently running the gauntlet and being bold about their experiments. If 80% is succeeding, then you're not really testing genuine unknowns. However, here's the problem. When executive teams and boards hear about failed experiments, they tend to hear only one word: failed. Okay? Successful experiments are celebrated more than failed ones, which in turn drives a hope and expectation, or a hope and a desire more likely, that an experiment should be successful. The flip side is that we therefore don't truly explore those more way out there ideas, truly explorative ideas. We bias towards innovation that's closer to our core, where there are fewer unknowns. Now, many of my clients think they're super innovative when they have 2 or 3 big growth initiatives that they're backing wholeheartedly. Now, these are large incumbents full of very smart people. So it would be both inaccurate and a bit disrespectful to say that they're not sophisticated. Okay? However, they are overconfident. They think they can use their brains to pick a few growth ideas that will create step change business opportunities or alternatively change their industry. But venture capitalists don't bat at 3 from 3. So why should we expect big incumbents to be able to do so as well? And my partner Fred, in the book that you've got, Invincible Company, he talks about the importance of volume when it comes to innovation. If a large incumbent has 3 big growth opportunities that they're pursuing, show me the 17 that have been discarded sitting on the scrap heap based on real evidence. Most of the time, these 17 don't exist. Or at best, there's been some internal prioritization mechanism based on criteria such as, for example, desirability, viability, feasibility. Very useful. However, it's more an internal exercise where these 3 have been deemed the winners, okay, and the other 17 have been discarded. But that's not experimentation. That's using our brains to pick the winners. Now, it's virtually impossible to remove all emotion and vested hope in an experiment being successful. But if we celebrate the process more than the outcome, the outputs often take care of themselves. The realization we need from our leaders is that no one's ego enjoys being involved with the losers. And once we acknowledge this, we can reorientate what we value. Not the win-loss, but the rocking up to play. If innovation is a volume game, then we all have to get comfortable with losing, which is really, really tough for the alpha leader who has most likely made every single career post a winner. Let's go to realization 4. Your ego, and hence you, are the problem. So I once asked the CEO of one of Australia's largest companies why he thought he had risen to the CEO role when others hadn't. And the humble response was there was an element of luck involved, but ultimately he thought he was really skilled at being able to interpret data to extrapolate the future, and as a result make tough calls based on insight. But that answer is all about knowledge and expertise. Okay? It assumes that the past is a good indicator of the future, which may be true in the world of complicated, but not always so in complex, which is where innovation sits. Having seen the movie before is more likely a limiting factor when trying to reimagine your industry. So here's the big question then. When it comes to the VUCA world of complex problems, how do I, as the CEO, add value? Or that as a senior executive? My whole career has been based on knowing answers and making good calls to drive good outcomes. And now you tell me I have to lose lots. Everything that served me well up till now, my knowledge and my expertise, no longer counts. So how the hell do I add value? How do I justify being CEO when I'm meant to know as little as the next person? So normally the response I get is thanks, but no thanks. My intellect and intuition has served me well up till now, so why should I suddenly abandon them? Well, of course, I'm not asking my clients to abandon these things, but they've been using a hammer when facing a nail, and suddenly they're facing a screw. Okay? The hammer doesn't always work. It's fine for the nail, and so therefore they should maintain and hang on to their intellect and intuition, but use it at the right time, use it when it's needed. But most senior leaders simply don't want to accept personal realization number 4. It's the belief that we add value through our intellect that's stopping organizations from successfully innovating. We are the problem, us and our egos. As I said, most people simply aren't built to realize this. It's just too confronting. And I too am most people. So I had no idea. Why? Because I'd been successful. I judged my worth via my CV, my accomplishments. This is where my ego lived. Some people are lucky. They manage to transcend this view of success. But most of us never can. Now, I won't go into all the theory about Robert Kegan's stages of adult development, but he talks about the transition from the socialized self to being self-authored, a transition that the majority of adults never make. And I too was never going to make that transition because I was way too absorbed in myself and how others saw me. As I said, I was my CV, I was my knowledge, I was my ability to find answers. And then 6 years ago, I was incredibly lucky. In February 2017, at the age of 43, while singing on stage in a third world country, I had 2 massive strokes. Now, at another time, I can tell you the truly spectacular story, and it was. But every doctor has since told me that I'm lucky to be here. There was air evacuation, the panic involved with 2 weeks of diagnostics in hospital, lumbar punctures, 10 MRIs, specialists arguing at the foot of my bed, a plan to open my heart, and then after all that, rehab, a gradual return to work, and facing the fear that I created in my wife and 3 children. And when I was in hospital just after the second stroke, literally with shit hitting the fan, not once did I think about what I had or had not achieved at work. It took me almost dying to realize that I'm more than what I know, the outcomes I deliver, and the outcomes and the things that I achieve. Reflecting on my life, it was the stuff that I created with others that had given me the most joy, not the hero calls born out of my intellect. But if my sense of self-worth is driven by achievement, which in turn comes from what I know and hear, then my ego has been stopping me from truly enabling innovation. It's hard for really senior executives to realize that their egos are holding them back too. Now, hopefully it doesn't take 2 large strokes to get there, but realizing your ego is tied up in knowing the answer, and that in turn stymies innovation. That's the 4th realization required if you're to enable your organization to truly innovate. So the 5th and final one. Now, the best innovators that I've met create an environment where it becomes all about the system and not about the players. Now, that sounds a little bit counterintuitive in today's environment where we value, in a people-centric era, we value every individual for their unique contributions. Nothing I'm saying here runs contrary to that. However, most corporate cultures celebrate outcomes, and in doing so, hero the individual efforts of those who have been involved in delivering those outcomes. Now, if you want to be an innovation leader, the job description has now changed. Your job is to get the hell out of the way and get your senior colleagues out of the way as well. Your job is to create an operating model that prioritizes innovation volume, allows experimentation that doesn't cost $1 million for an MVP that suddenly needs to succeed, but allows instead 33 experiments of $30,000, or as Paris said, maybe even $5,000. A system that builds muscle around the micro-experiment, that quickly measures innovation throughput, that heroes trying something and killing it off quickly, that creates a funding envelope that sustains experiments rather than artificial business case safeguards that everyone strives to meet but no one quite believes, creates a system that allocates amazing talent to innovation and not just core business. So it's all about the system. Your job as a leader is to create and nourish a system that allows colleagues to try, fail, learn, pivot, and embrace creativity. You need to find ways to reduce red tape, design fit-for-purpose governance. Notice how I didn't say remove governance. Empower people, but hold them accountable for performance, where performance is not about hitting home runs, but excelling in terms of inputs. Now, a point of clarification here. At the start, I said systems and processes were great, but not the answer. And now I'm talking about their importance. So am I being inconsistent? Not exactly. The innovating system with you out of the way is critically important. Okay? But it's a question of ordering and sequence. If you design that system before having embraced realizations 1 to 4, then the system you create will hero knowledge, false certainty, and hero outputs, all which are poorly suited to innovation. To create a system as part of realization number 5, you first have to embrace the other 4, which requires you to challenge some well-accepted norms. For example, in most companies, where does the young up-and-coming hotshot want to go? Given the choice of working in an operational environment, operational role with P&L line experience or line responsibility, okay, in the core business, or having a crack at something around non-core innovation and growth, where does the best talent gravitate towards? What's best for your career? Being a safe pair of hands that delivers a Horizon 1 big capital project, or having a crack at a bunch of innovation initiatives that are more likely destined to fail and killing them off after a month? For many organizations, innovation is the graveyard of professional development, especially if innovation experiments are destined to be losers. Careers simply don't get made by being involved with losing initiatives. But if our culture, our incentives, and our career progression all penalize innovation, especially compared to the core, where will our best people go? And where will our executives focus their attention? So your job as an innovation leader is to arrest the systemic penalization of innovation. And not everyone on the executive team will be on board, especially given the new system we're talking about promotes many of the skills and mindsets that are going to be really difficult for them to embrace. So you have to bring them on the journey or get them out of the way. We collectively are the problem, and so are our senior colleagues. If you want innovation to succeed, make it less about you and the knowledge and answers you think you have, and all about the innovation operating model. Your job is one of systems design and enablement. Big decisions reaching your desk is a sign of systems failure rather than your importance. So you need to leave the answers to others and trust that the processes you've put in place will allow your teams to play the volume game, the numbers game, that will ultimately lead to innovation success. So let me wrap up. To state the obvious, you can't jump to realizations 4 and 5 without having gone through the journey of realizations 1, 2, and 3 to start with, because this is a journey. And I believe that large incumbents don't innovate because most of their leaders are simply not able to make it on this journey. I feel it's increasingly negligent on our part to help organizations with step change if we don't also start to unpeel the protective layers that inhibit these realizations from being achieved. Layers that were established all the way back when we were at school from how we've been socialized. Now, innovation and step change is critical to Australia's future. From an incumbent organization perspective, we are fat, happy, and protected. We have one of the least innovative corporate cultures in the developed world, and we cannot rely on mineral resources forever. So if we don't do this, as a country, we're going to fall behind. So everyone here has a role to play. But we can't ask our leaders to go on this journey if we ourselves are not walking the path as well. Some of you will be well down that track. Some of you may be at the very end. But we all have to take it one step at a time. And wherever you are, especially if you're at the start, or if you are at the start, then we don't know the question is, in my book, as good a starting place as anything else. Thank you.